What is she wearing? Looks like she just walked in from a picnic. The whispers rippled across the sparkling yacht deck as Grace Parker stepped on board in her white linen dress, loose hair, flat sandals, and a worn silver bracelet on her wrist. An influencer with a sleek phone case spotted her first. He spun around, shining a ring light into Grace's face, not bothering to keep his voice low. "Guys, I think we just found the lowest budget guest of the night," he said, panning his phone's camera to catch her from every unflattering angle. "Get a load of the wrist bling." He zoomed in on the dull metal. "Now that's what I call vintage. Or maybe it just needs a good polish." A ripple of laughter rolled through the crowd around him. People shifted to see who he was filming, curiosity tinged with that cutthroat amusement that sometimes sparks at exclusive events. Most were decked in custom gowns and sharp tuxedos, hair shellacked and styled by expensive professionals, each outfit worth more than a family car. A woman brushed past her perfume thick like honey, carrying a designer clutch that clinked with gold hardware. She gave Grace a once-over, the kind that people in that world perfected over years of exclusive schooling and well-funded social exposure, then shot the influencer a conspiratorial smirk. "Hold the stream up," the woman said to him, flipping her hair. "Let's see if she says anything." Then with a sweet-laced malice she addressed Grace. "Are you lost, dear? The crew quarters might be downstairs if that's where you're headed." Grace stood there without blinking. She kept her posture poised, shoulders back, chin level, though everything around her seemed to vibrate with disdain. The gentle sway of the yacht under her feet felt comforting in a strange way, like the ocean recognized a calmer presence amidst all this manufactured glitz. A slender man with a suspiciously bright smile approached next. The host. His name was Russell, though his face was more recognizable than his name, some minor aristocracy of Manhattan's finance scene. He looked as if he had been practicing the expression of graciousness in a mirror for half his life. His suit was impeccable navy, pinned precisely at the shoulders, no doubt tailored to the last millimeter. Approaching Grace, he offered a greeting that sounded so polite it nearly vibrated. "I'm afraid this party isn't really suited for someone of your tier," he said, allowing the last word to hang in the sea air. He spoke quietly, but not so quietly that others missed it. In fact, it was exactly the volume needed for those nearest to him to catch every syllable. A hush fell over the small circle forming around Grace. At least 5 pairs of eyes locked onto her. A short, older woman with diamonds dripping from her earlobes whispered loudly to a friend, "I didn't realize we were letting in street fashion. Did you know about this?" She flicked open a gilded fan to stir the air around her heavily made-up face. Several feet away, a duo of men wearing matching suits turned to watch. One adjusted the platinum watch on his wrist, leaning in to murmur something about standards and the exclusivity of the evening. Their disapproval was pointed, but it also carried a certain relish, like they enjoyed the tension that came with a good scandal at an otherwise predictable event. Grace quietly reached for a glass of water from a passing server's tray. The server, looking nervous, half-handed it to her. But he was jostled aside by a different hand, a young woman in a tight black cocktail dress who snatched the champagne flute next to it. "Oops," the young woman said. Her giggle was tinged with malice. "You can have the water, I guess?" There was a flutter of more hushed gossip. No one could have predicted that minutes later her billionaire husband's superyacht would appear on the horizon. That line was spoken in a mocking stage whisper by a man who snapped a photo of Grace, apparently misquoting some rumor floating around in the background. He snickered, not realizing how close to the truth he actually was. A swirl of confusion spread among the guests as they continued to subject Grace to a battery of insults. They had no idea who she truly was or why she carried herself with such composure. To them, she was simply an anomaly, a mismatched note in the middle of a carefully orchestrated ensemble of wealth and style. Grace took the water glass and kept her gaze on the shimmering surface of the drink rather than the luminous city skyline beyond the yacht's deck. Across the boat, the sparkling lights of the city painted an almost surreal backdrop. The yacht was anchored in New York Bay, a vantage point that revealed the full majesty of the Manhattan skyline. Under other circumstances, the scene might have been romantic, a once-in-a-lifetime evening of music, laughter, and swirling gowns. But in the hush of that circle, it felt more like a stage set for a bizarre confrontation. A small group of partiers soon noticed Grace's quiet presence. One of them, a wiry young man with bleached hair, raised his eyebrows in an exaggerated manner. "Is she lost?" he said, grabbing the elbow of a tall woman next to him. "She can't possibly be on the guest list. Maybe she borrowed a dress from the cleaning staff." They laughed with a performance that rang hollow, too loud, too forced, as if they wanted to be heard. Grace let her eyes move across their faces, but she didn't speak. The next moment she heard a snippet of conversation behind her. "Hey, let's get a photo." Like a before and after kind of thing. She turned to see a group of rich kids, their clothing sporting embroidered monograms, brand logos, discreetly placed yet still conspicuously recognized by those who knew. Their phones glimmered with rhinestone-encrusted cases and popped up in the air to aim at Grace. They shoved each other forward. One of them, a girl with an affected Valley Girl accent, raised her phone. We can caption it "Unluckiest Selfie of the Year." It'll blow up. People love a good cringe shot. Grace could see the phone's lens see herself in a reflection on the screen. Her white linen dress was simple, borderline plain, but it draped with a certain understated elegance that the others refused to perceive. The material caught the faint light of the yacht's overhead fixtures, making her look almost backlit in the camera. She had chosen it because it was comfortable, because it was a warm evening, because it reminded her of calm days at sea. But in the eyes of these onlookers, her clothing spoke a different language, one that clashed with their unspoken rules. They snapped photos, some tilting their heads to muster the most condescending expressions. Then they quickly typed the caption "Unluckiest Selfie of the Year" and posted it to their social accounts, giggling over potential likes and comments. One or two of them stepped away, satisfied with the comedic interlude they had just orchestrated. The rest lingered, hoping for more footage to share. Someone zoomed in on the silver bracelet around Grace's wrist. The battered old trinket had an inscription inside that no one else could see, but the external scuffs and tarnish were easy targets. "That silver thing. Looks like it came out of a donation bin," a man in a crisp black tux announced, leaning forward to squint. "Probably rummaged from one of those secondhand stores. Might be worth a few bucks if you sell it for scrap." Another round of laughter. Grace's hand moved involuntarily to the bracelet, her fingers tracing its edges. A subtle shift in the ocean breeze brushed a memory against her mind. The moment the silver touched her wrist for the very first time, there had been laughter too, but a softer, kinder sort of laugh. Someone had clasped it around her, letting her know it was a symbol of something more precious than money. Now hearing these strangers dissect its worth triggered a vivid echo of that day. No words formed inside her mouth, though. She simply inhaled and faced them with a faint, almost imperceptible smile. Nearby, the host stepped forward again, perhaps wanting to solidify his role as the night's gatekeeper of exclusivity. He placed a hand on Grace's shoulder lightly, but with enough authority to suggest he was about to usher her away. Before he could, she slipped from his reach with a practiced ease, moving a foot to the side so he touched only air. He coughed, then leaned in with a hushed tone that carried more weight than open yelling. "I do hope you understand. This is a high-level crowd. We strive to maintain a certain standard." His breath smelled like expensive whiskey and a faint trace of mint. There was no compassion in his words, only a measured politeness that indicated he wanted her gone. Grace responded with a simple nod, lifting the water glass to her lips. A sip of cold water, the clang of distant champagne glasses, and the low hum of boat engines surrounding them pressed at the edges of her awareness. She moved away from the center of the deck, slipping through small clusters of guests who parted for her, as if parted by some invisible barrier. Even the servers in their crisp uniforms seemed unsure how to approach her. She caught sight of a friend from high school, the one who had extended the invitation, standing by a curved marble bar. That old classmate had come into wealth through an elaborate series of business deals, or possibly an advantageous marriage. Grace wasn't certain. But the classmate looked over her shoulder in half embarrassment, half nervousness, pretending not to see Grace. The invitation had probably been extended out of politeness or a fleeting nostalgic impulse never intended to be accepted. Grace was about to set her water down when a swirl of voices rose behind her. "Is that a horn? Are we expecting another yacht? I thought this was the biggest one tonight." The question echoed among the crowd. A second voice spoke. "It's definitely a horn, but it didn't come from this boat." Silence fell. An unnatural hush. Even the influencer cut his live stream for a second to listen. The host paused mid-conversation with a group of fashion editors, eyebrows furrowing. Someone tapped the side of a champagne flute, uncertain. Heads craned toward the horizon. The sparkling city lights shimmered on the water, but further out something large was moving, pushing waves in its path and glowing with a brilliance that overshadowed the standard yacht decor. Another horn sounded resonant and confident. The hush turned to hushed speculation, the tension morphing into a sweet, anxious electricity. In that fraction of time, Grace's knuckles grazed the cool metal railing. The wind teased her hair. A swirl of memory drifted on that breeze, an older gentleman's voice telling her that the ocean had a heartbeat, that if she closed her eyes on a quiet night, she could feel the pulse of the water. That same voice had said that real strength never needed to shout. It simply existed steady and sure until the world recognized it. She stood at the railing without a word, letting the moment unfold. A hush locked onto the deck like a slow freeze. The new arrival glided into view, a vessel that dwarfed even this party's extravagant host yacht. A slender, elegant design, but imposing in height and length, ablaze with subtle lighting that reflected gold onto the dark waters. A hush so profound that champagne glasses halted mid-sip, expensive jewelry glittered without the usual accompaniment of chatter, and no one had the presence of mind to fill the silence. On the hull, an emblem gleamed under the reflective lights. A crest shaped like a shield with a stylized H in the center crowned by laurel leaves. Recognition rippled across the crowd. Harrison International emerged in frantic whispers. Known for real estate, global finance, luxury goods, and known for the family fortune behind it. The yacht docked alongside them, impeccably maneuvered by a crew that operated with the tight precision of a military unit. More than a few people recognized the significance of that name. The Harrisons were rumored to own not only this marina but several others along the East Coast. If they wanted to anchor a massive ship next to your boat, they did it, and you were grateful for the privilege. A bridge extended, connecting the monstrous vessel to the party yacht. For a moment no one appeared, which only intensified the hush. A flutter of motion. Then a tall man emerged, stepping from the Superyacht in a navy suit, the wind tousling his dark hair. He carried a small microphone in one hand, though it dangled at his side as if he hadn't quite decided how to use it yet. The crowd, transfixed, parted. Some recognized him as Ethan Harrison, that elusive young billionaire who had turned old money into something new and dynamic, who had been at the center of gossip columns for years yet rarely appeared in public. He was rumored to be brilliant, philanthropic, and fiercely protective of his privacy. "Grace, will you come over here?" he called, scanning the deck with a purposeful gaze. "I've been waiting for you all night." The shock that rippled through the party was almost comical in its intensity. No one had seen that coming. Their stares pivoted as a single unit toward Grace. The woman in the black cocktail dress nearly spilled her champagne. The host blinked, speechless. The influencer cursed under his breath and fumbled with his phone, trying to resume filming. Everybody was itching to see how the woman they had just ridiculed would respond. Grace lowered her water glass. She turned, caught Ethan's eyes, and moved across the deck, weaving between still forms of socialites. At that moment, their entire world seemed to tilt. Everyone had been so certain that she was an imposter. Now the very man who owned most of the yachts in the marina was beckoning her. Grace stepped to the end of the gangplank, and Ethan Harrison extended his hand. Without a trace of hesitation, she placed her hand in his, letting him guide her up onto the higher vantage point of the Superyacht's deck. In full view of the stunned onlookers, he embraced her, resting one hand gently at the small of her back. She responded with a quiet warmth that spoke of deep familiarity. Even the wind appeared to pause, as if uncertain how to proceed. Ethan lifted the microphone, clearing his throat. "Most of you don't know this," he said, his voice resonating through the yacht's built-in speakers, "but Grace is my wife. She's the most inspiring person in my life." Silence weighed on the scene, though it buzzed with shock and adrenaline. The same eyes that had rolled and passed judgment were now wide, searching for some explanation. There was none. Grace stood quietly, letting Ethan's presence envelop her. Her white linen dress fluttered in the wind, the silver bracelet catching the reflection of the yacht's lights. Ethan's gaze swept the crowd politely, but without a trace of humor. "From today forward, anyone who mocked or belittled Grace will no longer be welcome at any event hosted aboard my fleet." He paused for the weight of the statement to sink in. A few camera flashes popped. People were half convinced this was some kind of staged spectacle. Others realized with cold clarity that Ethan Harrison was not joking. He owned these yachts. He owned even the water rights around them, or so they'd heard. If he chose to ban them, their precious invites and future business deals might evaporate. The tension turned sharper, a swift shift from arrogance to fear. The host, Russell, who had tried to usher Grace off the boat, cleared his throat in a pitiful attempt to smooth the situation. He began a sentence about misunderstandings and regrets, but Ethan raised a hand, quieting him. A small crowd of influential men and women took hesitant steps backward, no longer daring to assume any authority here. The influencer, phone in hand, stammered an apology that no one quite listened to. A man with gold cufflinks fidgeted, pulling at his collar. Suddenly, the diamond-clinking sounds of the party resumed, but hollowly. The atmosphere changed. Whispered conversation replaced the once loud music. People looked anywhere but at Grace as though to avoid acknowledging their cruelty. Several individuals risked a glance at her face, hoping to see anger or condemnation, perhaps even to find a path toward quick forgiveness if she showed any opening. But Grace didn't scold or point fingers. She never mentioned any of the humiliations. Instead, she offered a gentle, grateful look to those who had retreated into the shadows. Approaching them, she thanked each person sincerely. "You've helped me understand the true value of simplicity and self-respect." The crowd around her shrank back in surprise. Sincerity was not what they expected. Some even looked more ashamed by her kindness than they would have been by rage. A hush lingered on the deck, broken only by waves lapping against the hulls. The city skyline behind them, golden towering full of ambition, seemed to mirror the shift in tone. An abrupt cheer rang out from some corner of the yacht. A few guests who recognized the Harrison name as a potential ally lifted their glasses in a forced, obsequious toast, but it died away quickly, overshadowed by the awareness that this was no ordinary social scenario. Grace looked out at the water, the bracelet on her wrist glinting a quiet presence that radiated more dignity than 1,000 diamonds. Ethan took her hand. The microphone was off now, but he spoke in a voice that still carried. "I've arranged a charitable gala for next week," he said. "I hope all of you will consider joining us. The focus will be on supporting individuals who've been turned away from events like this for not meeting arbitrary standards. I believe we can all do better." A murmur of agreement rose. A few rebellious souls forced broad smiles, eager to curry favor. Others looked genuinely moved or at least stricken by guilt. They bowed their heads as if uncertain how to greet Grace now that they realized who she was. She remained near the edge of the deck, the city lights weaving patterns in her eyes. In the faint illumination, an almost imperceptible flash seemed to connect her to a memory. Years ago, there had been another yacht somewhere off the Amalfi coast. The salt air had tasted different, but the sea was always the sea. A voice had told her that all the wealth in the world meant nothing if you couldn't stand bare before the wind and still feel complete. That voice, paternal and wise, had ensured that she'd known the difference between real worth and superficial illusions. During the next several days, though the guests on that yacht didn't know it yet, Grace would collect the words and actions of those who had ridiculed her. She would use them to launch an initiative, Embrace Simplicity. A campaign she would design to remind people that true worth has nothing to do with outward display. She intended to put those words to use to show the world that real kindness, real strength, and real wealth exist in intangible forms. But on that particular night, Grace simply stood at the railing, letting the sea breeze tangle her hair, letting the hush of the waves calm the tension in her shoulders. Several people approached with apologies, most forced some heartfelt. She shook their hands and accepted their words without scorn. Word traveled quickly, and even the influencer, whose phone was still capturing bits of the aftermath, found his voice trembling as he tried to say he was sorry. She offered him the same faint smile she'd offered everyone else. They resumed the party in a stilted manner. Music began to play again, though lower than before, and servers gingerly circulated with silver trays of champagne. But the atmosphere was different, as if a potent reminder had slid across every conversation that behind every stranger could lie a power or story greater than any outward appearance could ever display. And while that party struggled to recover its earlier extravagance, Ethan guided Grace along the side of his own yacht. The moment they were out of earshot, he brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. His expression, gentle yet concerned, seemed to convey a silent apology for arriving later than planned. She looked into his eyes, warm with genuine care and a flicker of concern. A subtle acknowledgement passed between them, an understanding that words couldn't fully capture. Grace glanced at her bracelet, remembering the day a friend had placed it on her wrist, the laughter, the swirl of ocean air, the vow that simple things held the greatest meaning. No one else saw that recollection pass over her face. But once it did, she lifted her chin and turned back to the crowd. In a voice measured and calm, she said to Ethan, "Let's stay for a moment longer. There are people I'd like to thank." He inclined his head, stepping behind her in silent support, letting her lead. That was the dynamic between them, a shared respect, unwavering. As she returned to the party yacht's deck, a hush spread once more, but this time it felt expectant. She made her way among the clusters of guests, some of whom parted graciously now, overcompensating for their earlier rudeness. There was an older man with an aristocratic bearing, wearing medals on his lapel from philanthropic societies he'd funded. He looked at her with pinched regret, remembering his earlier remark about the cleaning staff. Grace approached him calmly. He cleared his throat, muttering, "Well, dear, I fear we started on the wrong note. Let me explain." She cut him off gently, shaking her head with a small, understanding smile. No lecture, no drawn-out condemnation. The man stepped aside, his face flushed, unsure what to do with the sudden release from blame. She moved on to a group of young women, one still clutching her phone. They'd posted that unluckiest selfie of the year, which was even now getting traction online, though they were too embarrassed to mention it. Grace gave them a polite nod, accepted a lukewarm apology, and continued past, leaving them in a flurry of uneasy chatter. As the night wore on, the atmosphere shifted from hostility to an odd reverence. Grace had arrived in plain attire, and she left no illusions that she would pretend otherwise. There was no last-minute costume change, no sudden reveal of hidden jewels. She remained just as she was, only now accompanied by the undeniable presence of her husband, who commanded the waters around them. People watched her with a new kind of awe. Some were curious, some envious, some inspired. A while later, the music picked up again in an attempt to recapture some semblance of a high society party. Couples danced carefully, ignoring the memory of tension. But the older crowd, the ones who prided themselves on reading social dynamics, recognized that something had irrevocably changed. Whispers spread about Grace's background. Rumors soared, some partially true, some wildly incorrect. Perhaps she had been raised by a wealthy family overseas. Perhaps her lineage traced back to European royalty. Perhaps she was simply the luckiest woman in the city. They each tried to piece together the clues in her composed demeanor, in the respectful way she addressed people, and how the servers gravitated toward her as though she'd treated them like equals from the start. Near the stern, a cluster of guests parted to reveal Russell, the host, still standing with that tight-lipped smile. He caught Grace's eye and offered an awkward half-bow, then hurried forward to speak with Ethan. The conversation was brief. Grace only caught a snippet about an apology, a hope that nothing from tonight would tarnish future cooperation with Harrison International. Ethan replied with a politeness that was more formal than friendly, letting Russell sweat it out. Then the host turned to Grace, bowing his head once more, stumbling through words he rarely used. "I'm sorry. My words were out of line." Grace touched the bracelet on her wrist, the silver cold against her skin. She studied Russell's face, saw the regret, the fear, the embarrassment. Her voice emerged gentle. "I appreciate that," she said, not offering condemnation or acceptance. It was enough to make him shrink back a step, relieved she hadn't rebuked him further. He nodded, turning away, scurrying to salvage what remained of his impeccable social image. Behind the swirl of forced pleasantries, a handful of guests looked ready to leave. Their illusions of a perfect exclusive evening had been shattered. Others, especially the younger crowd, saw an opening for gossip that would last them weeks. Their phones glowed with texts and social media alerts, pictures of that moment when Grace walked across the gangplank to join Ethan, pictures of the crest on his Superyacht, pictures of the previously ridiculed woman who turned out to be the wife of a billionaire. The entire fiasco fueled 100 group chats, 1,000 rumors. If Grace had wanted to keep her identity hidden indefinitely, that moment was the end of it. The world would know. But perhaps that was the point, revealing her true self in a context that dismantled the illusions others held so dear. Ethan gestured for Grace to join him again. The party was winding down to small knots of conversation. The once lively DJ set had quieted, replaced by soft recorded lounge music. Servants cleared away half-finished plates and half-empty flutes. The city skyline beyond them glowed steadily, oblivious to the drama aboard. He leaned in close, speaking so only she could hear. "I don't want you to have to stay here if you're uncomfortable. My captain's ready to take us wherever you like." His tone was gentle, more personal than the commanding presence he'd displayed moments earlier. Grace glanced around. Maybe a half hour ago she'd been humiliated in the center of this crowd. Now many had retreated, some had apologized, and a few had begun rethinking their entire approach to such events. She caught sight of the influencer who had turned his phone's camera on himself, delivering a pained apology to his viewers. She could hear scraps of it. "I've been taught a valuable lesson here tonight, guys. We should never judge a book by its cover." His face looked as though he was swallowing the word cover like a bitter pill. She gave Ethan's hand a reassuring squeeze. Soon she said in a voice that carried calm finality, though she didn't elaborate. He nodded, respecting her decision. A memory surfaced as a faint recollection of a day on a far simpler boat, perhaps from childhood. The slow rocking, the sunlight skipping across gentle waves. A man's hand on a rudder guiding them away from the shore to teach her that the horizon was bigger than any prejudice or shallow opinion. She stood at the edge of the yacht once more, letting the gentle pitch of the deck carry her back to the present. There was a swirl of night air heavy with the brine of the bay. She noticed a faint trembling in the hostess who approached, now Russell's wife, a woman in a midnight blue gown. Beneath that well-crafted social mask, she seemed stricken. Her voice shook when she spoke. Mrs. Harrison, if there's anything we can do to show our regret, please let us know. Grace's response was brief, but the hostess clutched it as though it were a life raft. She retreated, heading off to calm guests who were frantic about whether they were on Harrison's blacklist. Over the next few minutes, a series of people approached Grace and Ethan, offering so many variations of the same apology that it became background noise. Finally, in a lull, Grace and Ethan made their way to the gangplank, stepping onto his massive yacht. The difference in ambiance was immediate. Where the party yacht reeked of tension, forced laughter, and half-sincere social climbing, Ethan's was quiet. A respectful crew stood at attention. Warm lights illuminated a polished teak deck scattered with comfortable seating rather than designer displays meant to impress. Even the air felt calmer, as though the hustle and glare of the city behind them couldn't breach this floating sanctuary. Ethan put his arm around Grace's waist and led her inside. There, an intimate lounge offered plush sofas and large windows that let the moonlit water reflect inward. A discreet steward offered drinks, but Ethan waved him away. The steward bowed lightly, retreating. Grace's sandals clicked softly on the polished floor. She looked around, noticing subtle design choices that made the space inviting rather than ostentatious. It was less about showing off and more about comfort, about welcoming people as valued guests. She remembered the first time she'd stepped onto this yacht. The hush of the engines, the way Ethan had introduced her to the staff by her first name, the nods of respect they'd exchanged. Those were the details that mattered to her, not the price tag or the brand name. When she turned, Ethan was watching her. His expression held a mixture of empathy and pride. "I'm sorry I couldn't arrive sooner," he said softly. "I wish you hadn't had to endure all that alone." Grace looked down at the silver bracelet. Her fingers slid over its aged surface. There were no words to describe the swirl of sensations inside her: disappointment in the cruelty of others, yet gratitude for the reminder that she had chosen a simpler path, one that gave her a vantage point to see people's true colors. She let a moment pass between them, the silence deeper than any explanation. A subtle nod let him know she was all right. Ethan placed a hand over hers, the bracelet cool beneath his palm. He exhaled. "We'll do the gala next week. I've already sent out some invitations to those who, well, let's say, might not have felt welcome at events like Russell's. Will you help me host it?" Grace's eyes lifted to meet his. A slight tilt of her head. That was all the answer he needed. He pulled her into a warm embrace, the tension of the night slowly melting. Outside, in the slip of watery darkness between the two yachts, the city continued. Horns blared faintly in the distance. Lights sparkled. The party on the smaller yacht was dispersing in subdued clusters. Inside Ethan's superyacht, the night was still, except for the purr of generators and the hush of water against the hull. A swirl of memory rose again, triggered by the subtle hum of a yacht engine. She could almost feel the arms of a family member guiding her across a gangplank when she was very young, telling her that any journey worth taking required a willingness to see what others refused to see. No explicit statement or lecture, just a presence that said she was not alone, that she carried a legacy bigger than clothes, jewelry, or social rank. She still carried that legacy, a sense of calm purpose. With it came a quiet power, not the type that demanded applause, but the type that could change a room by simply existing. And so she changed the tone of an entire party that night by standing in her linen dress and worn silver bracelet, refusing to take the bait of shame. She left them to grapple with a truth they hadn't wanted to face, that humility can have more authority than ostentation. And so it stood. A tide had turned. The next time someone commented on the plainness of another's outfit, they might remember the story of Grace Parker Harrison, the picnic guest who turned out to be a billionaire's wife, and beyond that, a true force of empathy. She never changed her dress. She never raised her voice. But when the sea split and the lights touched her face, they saw what they'd refused to see. And no one forgot her after that. Please consider liking, sharing, commenting, and subscribing to our channel for more stories that celebrate the quiet power of dignity and simplicity.